Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us.
That's great to be back.
Today, we're tackling something that's been on my mind a lot recently.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the media landscape and, how much it's changing and
Well, yeah,
how we fit into it these days.
definitely.
Like, are we all producers now?
Right.
That's a big question.
It's a question that's been buzzing around for a while now, hasn't it?
It really has, and luckily, we have a fantastic academic article as our guide today to help us unpack all of this. It's called Are We All Producers Now? Convergent in Media Audience Practices
Hmm.
by S. Elizabeth Bird.
Hmm.
So hopefully by the end of this deep dive, we'll have a better sense of, if this idea of the producer is really as revolutionary as some people claim.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, this idea that the internet has just completely changed, how we interact with media.
Yeah, like we're not just passively watching TV anymore, are
Yeah,
we? We're liking, commenting, sharing things. It feels like everyone's got a voice and a platform now, but, is that really the case?
Well, and that's, I think, what's so interesting about this article is that it sort of starts by kind of defining some of the terms that get thrown around a lot, like
Okay.
convergence culture,
Yeah.
which I'll admit, when I first saw that, I was like, oh gosh, this sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah.
But it's actually, when you break it down, it's a pretty simple idea, and it's something that we all experience every day.
Yeah, can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so basically think about, your own media consumption. I mean, you probably switch between your phone, your laptop, TV, maybe even a smartwatch, all within like an hour.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Right. So it's not just about the devices themselves, it's about this constant flow of information, this blurring of lines between, where media comes from and where it goes.
So instead of just having a few big, networks deciding what we watch, we're all kind of contributing to this massive media ecosystem.
Exactly. And that's really where this term producer comes in. The article draws on some definitions by thinkers like Jenkins and Bruns, who argue that producers are basically what happens when, those traditional roles of producer and consumer kind of merge together
Okay.
in these interactive environments.
Right. So it's not just about watching a YouTube video. It's about leaving a comment,
Yes.
sharing it with your friends, maybe even creating your own response video.
Exactly. It's about, actively participating in that whole process of creating and circulating content, not just passively consuming it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of something I read a while back about this term prosumer. Wasn't that an idea from way back in the 80s?
Yes, you're right. Toffler, way back in 1980, was already talking about this shift, towards people taking on a more active role
Wow.
in producing goods and services.
Yeah.
And then another thinker, Kotler, even talked about how this would impact marketing.
Wow.
They were really ahead of their time when you think about it.
They really were.
Mm.
I mean, think about Time Magazine naming you like the everyday person of the year
Yes.
back in 2006
Mm-hmm.
because of the power of user-generated content.
Yeah, it was a
Mhm.
huge moment. It really captured, I think, the optimism that people felt, around this whole new media landscape. But and this is where I think the article gets really interesting. It also starts to ask, is all this participation really as transformative as it seems?
Yeah, that's a good question, right?
Right.
Like, I love sharing a good meme as much as the next person, but, does that really make me a producer in the same way as someone who's creating, a whole web series or something?
Right, and that's a really key point, I think. The article really challenges us to sort of, look beyond the hype
Right.
and really examine the reality of, how people are actually engaging with media. The majority of people aren't actively creating content, even if they are interacting,
Right.
more than they used to.
Yeah, so maybe not everyone is a filmmaker or journalist in the making, but, there's still a lot of value in liking and sharing and commenting.
Yeah. There can be, but I think we need to be realistic about, the scale of things. One scholar, Van Dyke, whose work is cited in the article, found that only about 1% of people online are actively producing content.
1%.
Yeah, another 10% might, comment or share, but the vast majority
Wow.
are really just viewing.
That's a much smaller number than I would guessed.
Right.
It makes you think, about the impact of all this producage,
It really challenges us to think critically about what kinds of participation are truly meaningful.
Right.
And whether this, this shift in power from producers to audiences is as significant as we might believe.
Okay, so the article goes on to discuss this case study by one of Bird's students, Mike Rapici, who compared fan-generated content for Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails
Right.
Could you walk us through that a little bit? I'm curious to see how that plays into this whole discussion.
Absolutely. It's a really great example, I think, of how the quality of that producage can vary so much
Okay.
depending on how participation is structured.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this musical showdown.
All right, so we've got Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails, right? And they both encouraged fan participation, but in very different ways.
Okay.
So Radiohead partnered with this animation platform called Aniboom, and they offered a prize for the best animated music video for one of their songs. And what they got back were these incredibly creative, really sophisticated animations. The fans were having these in-depth discussions, analyzing the lyrics, really pushing the boundaries of, what fan-made content could be.
That's cool. So it was more than just like slapping together some clips from the band's concerts.
Oh, yeah, way more. It was like they were creating art inspired by the music. Now, contrast that with Nine Inch Nails. They went a more open route. They used YouTube for their fan video contest. No prize, no real guidelines.
Right.
And the results were, well, a lot less impressive.
I'm guessing it was a lot of like people just goofing off in front of a webcam.
Pretty much, yeah. A few decent videos here and there, but mostly just a flood of, as you said, people goofing off. And the comment sections were full of pretty banal stuff. Nothing like the thoughtful discussions,
Right.
happening around that Radiohead contest.
So what's the takeaway here? Is it that like some fan bases are just more creative than others?
I mean, that's certainly possible, but I think the bigger point here is that the way that participation is structured can have a huge impact on the quality of the producage.
Right.
If you give people a clear goal, some inspiration, and a platform that really encourages, thoughtful engagement, you're more likely to get something really special.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So-
It's like anything else, right? If you want quality results, you need to set people up for success.
Exactly.
But this whole discussion about online participation is making me think like, is that all there is to this producer idea?
That's a great question, and that's something that the article really dives into. Bird argues that focusing solely on online fandom is actually too narrow a view. There's a whole world of audience activity happening offline
Right.
that we need to consider as well.
So it's not just about like, who's making videos or writing blog posts.
Right.
It's about how people are engaging with media in their everyday lives.
Exactly. The article, points out how things like crafting, cooking, DIY projects, even how we plan our weddings, can be influenced by the media we consume.
Oh, that's so true. I know so many people who are like obsessed with those home renovation shows. And they're not just watching them, they're going out and like redoing their kitchens. It's like the media is giving them a blueprint for how to live their lives.
It's a really fascinating phenomenon. The article even mentions a study by Thompson who looked at Jane Austen fans.
Okay.
And, not only are they reading and discussing the books, but they're creating entire worlds inspired by them. They're sewing period costumes, learning historical dances, even crafting furniture based on descriptions from the novels.
Wow, that's dedication.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how deeply media can impact us.
Yeah.
Even in ways that we might not even realize.
Right.
But, with all this talk about producers and audiences taking control, has the power really shifted away from the big media companies? Or are they still kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes?
Now that is the million-dollar question.
Right.
And it's something that the article addresses head on.
Right.
It argues that, while audiences have gained some power, for sure, the media industry has also adapted to this new landscape.
So they're not just sitting back and letting us run the show.
Definitely not. They've become very adept at harnessing the energy of,
Okay.
producage for their own benefit.
Interesting. Can you give us an example? I always love to see how this plays out in like the real world.
Absolutely. So let's consider the case of Maria Digby,
Okay.
a singer who seemingly exploded onto the scene back in 2007. She was posting these homemade videos on YouTube, and they were getting millions of views. Everyone was talking about how this was, proof of the power of the internet, how anyone could become a star.
Oh, yeah. I remember her. Her videos were everywhere back then.
Right. Well, it turns out that she was already signed to a Disney record label.
Right.
And those homemade videos, they were professionally produced
Oh, wow.
and carefully marketed to create that viral sensation.
So it was all a carefully orchestrated marketing ploy. That's kind of disheartening.
It does make you think, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
raises the question of how we can even distinguish between, authentic producage and manufactured hype.
Right. So how do we do that? How can we be more discerning about what we see online?
Well, I think it comes down to being critical consumers of media, questioning what we see,
Okay.
digging a little deeper, looking for those hidden agendas. The internet is a powerful tool, but it can also be a tool for manipulation.
That's a really good point. It reminds me of something else the article brought up about how media can shape our perceptions and behaviors.
Exactly. Even when we think we're making, independent choices, we're often influenced by the stories and images that we consume.
Right.
The article uses this example of cider consumption and how, you know, through clever marketing campaigns, cider drinking was transformed from something that, your grandpa might enjoy to this cool, edgy choice for young people.
So even something as simple as what we drink can be influenced by media.
Absolutely. And it goes far beyond, just consumer choices. Think about how media narratives shape our understanding of things like politics,
Hmm.
social movements, even our own identities.
That's a little scary when you think about it.
It is.
It makes you realize how important it is to be aware of these influences and to really consume media with a critical eye.
It's crucial.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that, these dynamics aren't limited to the Western world.
Okay.
The article raises this really important question, does this producer model apply universally?
Okay.
Or is it limited by things like access and resources?
So we're expanding our scope now, looking at how this all plays out in different parts of the world.
Precisely.
Okay. I'm really intrigued to see where this goes.
Yeah.
Let's dive into that global perspective.
All right, let's do it. For many people, the level of, internet access that we kind of take for granted here just isn't a reality.
Right. And we forget that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Bird shares this really striking anecdote from her fieldwork in rural India.
Hmm.
And she describes these villages where, electricity is limited, TV access is shared,
Okay.
and people's engagement with media looks totally different, from what we might see in a more digitally connected society.
So like instead of, creating YouTube videos or participating in online forums, their media experience might be more about, shared viewings of Bollywood films or listening to the radio.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a really good reminder that there are many ways to engage with media, and those experiences are just as valid and important.
Yeah, it's like we're getting this glimpse into a whole different media landscape,
Mm-hmm.
one that operates outside of our, our usual assumptions.
Absolutely. And to contrast that image a bit, the article also highlights this fascinating case of Nollywood.
Nollywood.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
So it's the Nigerian film industry,
Okay.
and it is absolutely booming. What's so remarkable about it is that it's largely a grassroots movement. They're relying on affordable digital technology for production and distribution, often bypassing the internet altogether.
Wait, so they're creating and distributing films without relying on the internet?
Yeah. They've managed to build this really thriving industry.
That's incredible.
It is, and it really caters to local audiences, tells stories from their own perspectives. Aba, a scholar who's mentioned in the article, argues that Nollywood films have really become a powerful platform for social critique,
Interesting.
addressing issues like, politics and gender corruption.
Wow, that's really powerful. It challenges this idea that, producage requires widespread internet access and, the specific type of digital literacy.
It certainly does. And what's even more interesting is that Nollywood operates largely outside the influence of these global corporations, which, allows filmmakers a level of creative freedom that you often don't see in more established film industries.
So it's like this parallel universe of producage, driven by local needs and creative energy and largely free from the influence of these big media companies.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that the relationship between media and audiences is constantly evolving and adapting
Yeah.
to different contexts.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've gone from defining what a producer even is to exploring how that concept plays out in these different, online and offline spaces and even across cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now of just how complex this whole idea of, audience participation is.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, right?
Yeah.
Challenging those assumptions, exploring these different perspectives, and coming away with a more nuanced understanding of, the world around us.
Exactly. So what's the key takeaway here? What should our listeners, be thinking about as they kind of navigate this ever-evolving media landscape?
I think the most important thing is to be mindful.
Yeah.
Mindful of, how we're engaging with media, mindful of the influences that are at play, and mindful of the diverse ways that, people all over the world are participating in this media ecosystem.
Mindful producers and mindful consumers. I love that.
And don't forget to be critical.
Right.
Ask those questions, challenge the assumptions, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper,
Hmm.
The media landscape is a fascinating place, and the more we understand it, the better equipped we are to really navigate it effectively.
That's a great point to end on. So to our listener, we encourage you to think about, your own media practices. How are you engaging with media?
Mm-hmm.
What influences are shaping your perceptions?
Mm-hmm.
And, what can you do to be a more mindful and critical participant in this ever-evolving media world?
The conversation definitely doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into this world of media and audiences.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.
For many people, the level of internet access that we kind of take for granted here in, North America and Europe and things just isn't a reality.
Yeah, that's a good point. We often just forget how much of our lives, revolve around being constantly connected.
Right. And Bird actually shares this really striking anecdote from her field work in rural India.
Hmm.
And she describes these villages where, electricity is limited, TV access is shared, and people's engagement with media looks totally different from what we might see in a more digitally connected society.
Yeah, like instead of, making their own YouTube videos or,
Yeah.
being in these big online forums,
Mhm.
their experience might be more about, shared viewings of Bollywood films or listening to the radio.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that, there are many ways to engage with media, and those experiences are, just as valid
Right.
and just as important.
Yeah. It's like we're kind of getting this little glimpse into a whole different media landscape,
Hmm.
one that operates outside of our usual assumptions.
Absolutely. And to contrast that image a bit, the article also highlights this fascinating case of
Or
Nollywood.
Bollywood.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar.
So it's the Nigerian film industry,
Yeah.
and it is booming. What's so remarkable about it is that it's largely a grassroots movement.
Mhm.
They're relying on affordable digital technology for production and distribution, and often bypassing the internet altogether.
Wait, so they're creating and distributing these films without even relying on the internet?
Yeah. They've built up this thriving industry that really caters to, these local audiences and tells stories from their own perspectives.
That's wild.
It is. And, Abaya, a scholar who's mentioned in the article, argues that Nollywood films have actually become a powerful platform for, social critique,
Interesting.
addressing issues like, politics and gender and corruption.
Wow, that's really powerful.
Hmm.
Kind of the challenge is this whole idea that producage requires, widespread internet access and this specific kind of digital literacy.
It really does. And what's even more interesting is that Nollywood operates largely outside the influence of, these global corporations, which allows filmmakers a level of creative freedom that you often don't see, in more established film industries.
So it's like this whole parallel universe of producage,
Yeah.
driven by these local needs and this creative energy that's kind of free from the influence of these big media companies.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that, the relationship between media and audiences is constantly evolving and adapting to different contexts.
This has been such an interesting conversation. I feel like we've gone from defining what a producer even is to exploring how that concept plays out in
Yeah.
different, online and offline spaces, even across cultures.
Hmm.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how complex,
Hmm.
this whole idea of audience participation really is.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, right? Challenging those assumptions, exploring different perspectives, and coming away with a more, nuanced understanding of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's the key takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about, as they navigate this constantly evolving media landscape?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be mindful.
Okay.
Mindful of how we're engaging with media, mindful of the influences that are at play, and mindful of the diverse ways that people, all over the world are participating in this media ecosystem.
Mindful producers and mindful consumers. I love that.
And don't forget to be critical.
Right.
Ask those questions. Challenge assumptions. Don't be afraid to dig a little deeper. The media landscape is a fascinating and complex place, and the more we understand it, the better equipped we'll be to navigate it effectively.
That's a great point to end on. So to our listener, we encourage you to think about, your own media practices.
Right.
How are you engaging with media? What influences are shaping your perceptions?
Mhm.
And what can you do to be a more, mindful and critical participant in this media world?
And the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into this world.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been such a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Yeah, it's been great.
Until next time, stay
Ah.
curious.